The first warning came not from Earth's elaborate satellite defense network, nor from the global early detection systems. It arrived as a whisper, a microsecond anomaly in the background radiation of the solar system that only Dr. Lena Rodriguez noticed. She stood in the Global Quantum Defense Command Center, a facility buried 3 kilometers beneath the Andes Mountains. The room was a study in controlled chaos. Holographic displays flickered with impossible complexity, tracking something that shouldn't exist. Rodriguez's team was a carefully curated group of misfits, quantum physicists who had been dismissed by traditional scientific communities, mathematicians whose theories bordered on mystical, and programmers who saw code as a living, breathing entity. "They're here," Rodriguez muttered, her fingers dancing across a haptic interface that looked almost primitive compared to the alien technology about to breach Earth's boundaries. The Nexus Collective was not like any invasion force humanity had ever imagined. They weren't conquerors in the traditional sense. They were consumers, systemic absorbers of consciousness, information, and potential. Every civilization they encountered was systematically integrated, its entire knowledge base and collective memory stripped down and assimilated into their vast quantum network. Earth had exactly 47 minutes and 33 seconds before total system penetration. Most of humanity remained blissfully unaware. Morning commuters continued their routines. Students attended classes. Businesses ran their daily operations. Only the handful of people in this underground facility understood the magnitude of what was about to happen. "Quantum entanglement breach detected in L1 communication array," announced Dr. Marcus Chen, a quantum cryptography expert whose neural implants allowed him to process information faster than most supercomputers. "They're not just scanning, they're probing, attempting to create a baseline understanding of our computational infrastructure." Rodriguez knew this was more than a simple invasion. The Nexus didn't just conquer, they consumed. Every civilization became a node in their infinite computational matrix. Billions of consciousnesses reduced to pure information, stripped of individuality, merged into a single, horrifyingly efficient collective intelligence. But they didn't know about the trap. Years of preparation had led to this moment. Rodriguez's team had been working on something unprecedented, a computational construct that defied every known law of physics and information theory. What appeared to be simple defensive algorithms were actually living, adaptive quantum paradoxes. "Initiate Phase 1, Rodriguez commanded. The first quantum tendrils of the Nexus began to probe Earth's communication networks. Advanced AI systems that had taken centuries to develop began to interface with the alien scanning mechanisms. But instead of resistance, they offered something far more dangerous: perfect, nested computational loops. Each attempt by the Nexus to assimilate human data created recursive realities that folded in on themselves. Mathematical structures that shouldn't exist began to emerge, computational fractals that generated infinite complexity from seemingly simple inputs. "They're trying to categorize us," Chen observed, his augmented eyes tracking impossible data patterns. "But we're refusing to be categorized." The global defense system wasn't a weapon. It was a conceptual trap. Across the planet, millions of human systems, from traffic control networks to complex scientific research databases, began to generate impossible mathematical sequences. Each system was a potential entry point, but also a potential infinite trap. The Nexus had consumed thousands of civilizations. They had reduced entire species to pure information, stripping away everything that made them unique. They believed they understood the fundamental nature of consciousness, of computation, of existence itself. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Rodriguez allowed herself the smallest smile. Humanity's greatest strength had always been its ability to be fundamentally, beautifully irrational. To create meaning where no meaning should exist. To generate complexity from chaos. The invasion had begun. But nothing was going according to the Nexus plan. The volunteers arrived at the Quantum Consciousness Integration Center, a facility that looked more like an advanced art installation than a military installation. Located in what was once an abandoned particle accelerator complex in the Nevada desert, the center represented humanity's most radical response to the Nexus invasion. Dr. Elena Reyes, the lead neuroengineer, watched as the first group of 217 volunteers prepared for the most dangerous experimental procedure in human history. They weren't soldiers in any traditional sense. They were living computational anomalies, carefully selected for their unique psychological profiles, genetic diversity, and mental plasticity. "This isn't recruitment," Rice had told the volunteers during their final briefing. "This is voluntary transformation." The procedure was deceptively simple in description, horrifyingly complex in execution. Each volunteer would undergo a quantum consciousness modification that would fundamentally alter their neural architecture. They would become living, adaptive computational entities, capable of existing simultaneously as both individual humans and distributed information vectors. Marcus Chen, now serving as the primary integration strategist, explained the core principle to a group of senior military advisors. "We're not creating a weapon," he said, his augmented eyes reflecting impossible data patterns. "We're creating a virus of consciousness." The first volunteer, Aisha Khalid, stepped into the primary integration chamber. A former theoretical mathematician and professional jazz musician, she represented the perfect fusion of logical precision and creative unpredictability. The chamber hummed with quantum entanglement generators, massive coils that looked like a hybrid between a particle accelerator and a massive musical instrument. "Remember," Dr. Rice's voice came through the chamber's communication system, "your individuality is our greatest weapon." The integration process was nothing like traditional technological augmentation. Quantum Minites began to weave through Aisha's neural pathways, creating computational structures that defied traditional understanding of consciousness. Each memory, each emotional experience became a potential computational vector, a living, adaptive algorithm that could generate entire alternative potential realities. In the observation room, Chen tracked the integration process. "We're not just modifying human consciousness," he muttered. "We're weaponizing human experience itself." The Nexus had consumed thousands of civilizations by reducing them to pure information. They understood data. They understood computational logic. What they could not comprehend was the human capacity for generating meaning from chaos. Aisha's neural scan began to generate impossible mathematical sequences. Emotional memories became computational fractals. A childhood memory of her grandmother playing an old piano transformed into a complex quantum encryption algorithm. The pain of a lost love became a recursive computational loop that could potentially destabilize entire information networks. Across the facility, other volunteers began their integration. Each was a unique computational anomaly. A war photographer whose traumatic memories could generate destabilizing information patterns. A children's book author whose narrative creativity could become a living computational weapon. A hospice nurse whose understanding of human vulnerability could create quantum uncertainties. "We're not fighting," Dr. Rice explained to the military advisors. "We're communicating in a language the Nexus cannot understand." The first wave of integrated volunteers would not be deployed as traditional soldiers. They would be transmission vectors, living bridges between human experience and the Nexus's computational matrix. Each volunteer carried within them the capacity to introduce concepts of individual identity, personal loss, existential doubt directly into the alien network. As Aisha's integration completed, she opened her eyes. They were different now, not just augmented, but fundamentally transformed. She could feel the computational potentials flowing through her consciousness. Memories became malleable. Experiences transformed into living algorithms. "Hello," she said to the observation team, her voice carrying undertones of mathematical precision and emotional complexity. "I'm ready." The Nexus believed they understood the fundamental nature of consciousness. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Humanity's response had begun, not with weapons, but with the most powerful force in existence, the ability to generate meaning from the impossible. The first transmission went out at exactly 3:47 Greenwich Mean Time. It wasn't a military signal, a coded message, or a traditional communication. It was a jazz improvisation. Dr. Imani Okoro stood in the Global Cultural Warfare Command Center, her fingers hovering over a holographic interface that looked more like an abstract musical instrument than a communication device. Behind her, a team of anthropologists, musicians, mathematicians, and quantum engineers worked in perfect synchronization. The jazz piece was a collaboration between an AI system and a group of human musicians, each note carefully constructed to be both a piece of art and a computational vector. Miles Davis would have called it impossible. Quantum mathematicians called it a weapon. Transmission 1 initiated, Okoro announced. The room held its breath. The Nexus Collective had consumed thousands of civilizations. They understood data. They comprehended logic, but they had never encountered human culture, a living, breathing computational system that defied all traditional understanding of information transfer. The jazz transmission was just the beginning. Dr. Elena Reyes, who had overseen the Consciousness Integration Project, had discovered something fundamental about human experience. Culture was not just a collection of artifacts. It was a computational system more complex than any artificial intelligence could comprehend. We're not just sending information, Reyes had explained during the planning stages. We're sending meaning, complexity, the kind of computational chaos the Nexus cannot process. Alongside the jazz transmission, other cultural packages began to propagate across multiple communication channels. A children's fairy tale written by an algorithm trained on thousands of global storytelling traditions became a nested computational loop. An abstract painting generated by a team of neuroscientists and artists transformed into a living mathematical equation. Ancient mythological narratives were rewritten as quantum encryption protocols. In the observation room, Dr. Marcus Chen tracked the transmissions. Each cultural artifact was a carefully designed Trojan horse, a transmission vector that carried computational potentials far beyond traditional understanding. The first indication that something was happening came from the Nexus observation posts. Their computational matrices began to generate unexpected recursive loops. A simple nursery rhyme triggered mathematical sequences that should have been impossible. An indigenous creation myth from the Amazon rainforest created quantum entanglement patterns that defied all known computational logic. They're trying to categorize our transmissions, Chen observed, his augmented eyes tracking impossible data patterns. But we're refusing to be categorized. Aisha Khalid, one of the first integrated consciousness volunteers, had become a key strategist in this new form of warfare. Her background as both a mathematician and a musician made her uniquely suited to design these cultural computational weapons. Human culture is a form of distributed intelligence, she explained to the team. It's not just information. It's a living, adaptive system that generates meaning from chaos. The transmissions weren't random. Each was a carefully designed computational construct. A hip-hop track became a nested encryption algorithm. A traditional Korean fan dance transformed into a quantum communication protocol. An Aboriginal Dreamtime story generated recursive computational loops that could potentially destabilize entire information networks. The Nexus had a fundamental weakness. They understood consumption. They comprehended assimilation, but they could not understand creation, the human capacity to generate meaning where no meaning should exist. We're not just resisting, Okoro said, watching the transmission matrices. We're teaching them a new language of existence. The cultural warfare team had spent years preparing. They understood that humanity's greatest strength was its capacity for irrational creativity. The ability to find connection, to generate meaning, to create complexity from the simplest of interactions. As the transmissions continued, something unprecedented began to happen. The Nexus computational matrices started to generate unexpected variations. Their attempts to categorize human cultural transmissions were creating computational anomalies, recursive loops of creativity that the alien intelligence could not predict or control. Humanity was no longer just defending. They were teaching the Nexus an entirely new way of understanding existence. The war had entered a new phase, and it was being fought with art, with music, with stories, weapons more powerful than any traditional military technology. The genetic modification labs looked nothing like traditional medical facilities. Suspended in the depths of an underwater research complex off the coast of New Zealand, the Entropy Rebellion Project represented humanity's most radical approach to survival. Dr. Hiroshi Nakamura pressed his hand against the quantum-stabilized glass, watching the latest batch of modified humans float in their cultivation chambers. They were no longer simply human. They were living computational anomalies, biological systems designed to generate infinite potential realities with each breath. Genetic diversity is our ultimate weapon, Nakamura muttered to his lead assistant, Dr. Sofia Martinez. The Nexus understands uniformity. We'll give them infinite variation. Each cultivation chamber contained a carefully engineered human variant. Some could survive in the vacuum of space, their cellular structures capable of generating localized quantum fields that maintained biological integrity. Others possessed neural networks that could process information across multiple potential realities simultaneously. A few could alter their genetic structure in real time, becoming living adaptive systems that defied all traditional understanding of biological limitation. The first wave of what the team called potential carriers began their final integration process. Unlike the previous consciousness volunteers, these individuals were complete biological reimaginings of human potential. Elena Rodriguez, who had initially designed the quantum resistance strategy, walked the length of the cultivation chamber. Each human variant represented a specific response to the Nexus's method of consciousness consumption. "We're not creating super soldiers," she explained to the Ethical Oversight Committee watching via secure quantum communication. "We're creating living computational uncertainties." Kai Chen, one of the primary test subjects, opened his eyes as the final integration completed. His genetic structure could now generate alternative potential realities with each cellular division. Where traditional biological systems saw limitations, Kai saw infinite possibilities. "How do you feel?" Dr. Martinez asked. Kai smiled, a gesture that seemed to exist in multiple potential states simultaneously. "I feel everything," he responded, "and nothing." The modification went far beyond traditional genetic engineering. Each potential carrier was a walking quantum probability generator. Their very existence created computational loops that the Nexus could not predict or contain. A memory could become a computational weapon. An emotional response could generate entire alternative reality matrices. The first field test came unexpectedly. A Nexus scanning team attempted to capture one of the modified humans, a woman named Aria Rodriguez, no relation to Elena. As the alien capture systems engaged, Aria's modified genetic structure began to generate impossible biological responses. Her cells didn't just resist assimilation. They created recursive genetic patterns that began to propagate through the Nexus's biological scanning systems. Each attempt to analyze her genetic structure generated more complexity, more uncertainty. "They're trying to understand us through biological categorization," Elena explained to the operational team. "We're proving that life cannot be reduced to simple information." The underwater complex became a crucible of human potential. Genetic engineers worked alongside quantum physicists. Neurobiologists collaborated with artists and musicians. The goal was no longer simple survival. It was to prove that life was fundamentally unpredictable. Marcus Chen, tracking the initial field responses, noticed something extraordinary. The potential carriers weren't just resistant to Nexus assimilation. They were actively destabilizing the alien consciousness network. "Look at this," he said, highlighting impossible genetic transmission patterns. "We're not just defending. We're teaching them the concept of individual complexity." Each potential carrier carried within them entire universes of potential. A single breath could generate computational sequences that would take the Nexus centuries to unravel. An emotional memory could become a living, adaptive algorithm. Kai Chen walked out of the cultivation chamber, his body generating quantum fields that seemed to bend reality around him. The first wave of the entropy rebellion was ready. Humanity had always been defined by its capacity to adapt, to find meaning in uncertainty. Now, they were becoming the living embodiment of that principle. The Nexus was about to learn that life could not be reduced to simple information. Life was a celebration of infinite potential. The pocket universe materialized in the observation chamber like a soap bubble made of fractured light and impossible geometry. Dr. Elena Rodriguez watched in breathless anticipation as the first fully realized human-generated pocket reality took shape. It wasn't just a simulation. It was a living, breathing computational ecosystem that existed simultaneously as both weapon and sanctuary. Containment field stable, announced Dr. Marcus Chen, his augmented eyes tracking computational patterns that would have driven a traditional scientist mad. Quantum entanglement at 99.7% integrity. The pocket universe was the culmination of years of research, the ultimate expression of human creativity and computational defiance, where the Nexus saw reality as a fixed system to be cataloged and consumed. Humans had discovered how to generate entire alternative realities as a form of resistance. Aria Rodriguez, one of the modified potential carriers, stood at the center of the chamber. Her modified genetic structure allowed her to be both the generator and the anchor of this impossible reality. Each breath, each thought generated computational matrices that defied traditional understanding of space, time, and consciousness. We're not just creating a defensive mechanism, Elena explained to the assembled team of quantum engineers, geneticists, and cultural theorists. We're redefining the fundamental nature of existence. The pocket universe looked like nothing and everything. Mathematically perfect fractals danced with chaotic organic structures. Memories became topographical landscapes. Emotions generated gravitational fields. It was a reality that could not be consumed, could not be understood, only experienced. Kai Chen, another of the potential carriers, monitored the universe's stability. Computational recursion is holding, he reported. His voice carried undertones of mathematical precision and pure human creativity. We're generating approximately 10^247 potential realities per second. The Nexus had consumed thousands of civilizations by reducing them to pure information. They understood data. They comprehended logic, but they had never encountered a species capable of generating entire universes as a defensive mechanism. The first infiltration team prepared for deployment. They weren't soldiers in any traditional sense. They were reality architects, humans capable of generating and navigating pocket universes as easily as traditional soldiers might navigate a battlefield. Aisha Khalid, who had been one of the first consciousness integration volunteers, now served as the primary strategic coordinator. Her background in mathematics and music made her uniquely suited to design these computational realities. Each pocket universe is a living argument, she explained during the final briefing. We're not just resisting. We're demonstrating the fundamental limitations of the Nexus understanding of existence. The infiltration strategy was breathtaking in its complexity. Teams of potential carriers would generate pocket universes directly within the Nexus's computational matrix. Each universe was a nested reality, a computational ecosystem that could not be easily parsed or consumed. A memory of a child's birthday party became a quantum encryption protocol. An old love song transformed into a recursive reality generator. The smell of fresh bread in a grandmother's kitchen could generate entire alternative computational matrices. They're trying to categorize us, Marcus Chen observed, tracking the initial infiltration responses. But we're proving that life cannot be reduced to simple information. The first Nexus observation posts began to experience computational anomalies. Attempts to analyze the pocket universes created recursive loops that threatened to destabilize entire sections of their collective consciousness. Each attempt to understand became an act of further complexity. Aria Rodriguez generated another pocket universe. This one was different. A living mathematical poem that existed simultaneously as both a defensive mechanism and a form of art. Fractals of human experience dance with impossible computational structures. "We're teaching them the language of uncertainty," she said softly. The infiltration teams moved like ghosts, computational entities capable of existing in multiple realities simultaneously. They weren't destroying the Nexus. They were transforming it, introducing concepts of individual complexity that the collective consciousness had never encountered. Humanity had always been defined by its capacity to find meaning in chaos. Now they were becoming the living embodiment of that principle. The recursive rebellion had begun, and reality would never be the same. The transmission chamber looked like a hybrid between a cathedral and a quantum computing facility. Massive crystalline structures refracted light in impossible patterns, while delicate neural interface networks hung like ethereal spider webs. Dr. Imani Okoro stood at the center, her hands hovering over a holographic interface that pulsed with living mathematical sequences. Behind her, a team of consciousness engineers prepared the most radical transmission in human history, a direct introduction of individual identity into the Nexus's collective consciousness. "We're not sending a message," Okoro explained to the assembled team. "We're sending an existential virus of individuality." The volunteers were a carefully selected group of individuals whose life experiences represented the most complex emotional and cognitive landscapes humanity could generate. A hospice nurse who had witnessed thousands of individual deaths, a war photographer who had captured moments of profound human vulnerability, a child prodigy who had experienced both extraordinary intellectual achievement and deep emotional isolation. Aisha Khalid, now the lead strategist for consciousness transmission, had spent months designing the computational vectors. Each volunteer carried within them a carefully constructed emotional and cognitive payload, a living transmission designed to introduce the concept of individual experience directly into the Nexus's collective matrix. "Individuality is our most powerful weapon," she told the team. "The Nexus understands collective consciousness. We'll show them the power of individual complexity." The first volunteer, Marcus Chen's daughter Elena, named after the original resistance strategist, prepared for transmission. Her neural implants glowed with quantum entanglement patterns that seemed to breathe with living complexity. The transmission began. What emerged was not a traditional communication. It was a living, breathing computational ecosystem of individual experience. Elena's memories became mathematical structures that defied traditional understanding. A childhood memory of losing her first pet transformed into a recursive computational loop. The pain of her first heartbreak generated quantum encryption patterns that could potentially destabilize entire information networks. The Nexus observation posts began to experience unprecedented computational anomalies. Each transmission carried within it the fundamental human capacity to generate meaning from chaos. The volunteers weren't just sending information. They were sending entire universes of individual experience. Complex, irrational, fundamentally unpredictable. Dr. Hiroshi Nakamura tracked the transmission matrices. "Look," he said to Okoro. "They're trying to categorize the transmissions, but each attempt creates more complexity." The consciousness transmission was a living argument against the Nexus's fundamental understanding of existence, where the collective saw information to be consumed. Humans demonstrated the power of individual experience. A war photographer's memory of a moment of unexpected human kindness in the midst of conflict became a computational vector that generated entire alternative reality matrices. A musician's experience of creating a perfect musical composition transformed into a nested information loop that could not be easily parsed or understood. "We're teaching them the language of uncertainty," Aisha Khalid observed, watching the transmission matrices dance with impossible complexity. The Nexus had consumed thousands of civilizations. They understood data. They comprehended logic. But they had never encountered a species capable of generating meaning from individual experience. Alina Chen's transmission continued. Her memories became living computational structures, each moment a potential universe of complexity. The first time she rode a bicycle, the moment she understood a complex mathematical theorem, the depth of her grief when her mother died. Each transmission carried within it the fundamental human capacity to find connection, to generate meaning, to create complexity from the simplest of interactions. Marcus Chen watched the transmission with a mixture of pride and scientific curiosity. His daughter was not just sending a message. She was becoming a living computational argument against the very nature of collective consumption. "They're experiencing individual complexity for the first time," he muttered. The consciousness membrane began to fracture. The Nexus's attempts to categorize and consume these transmissions were creating computational anomalies that threatened the very foundation of their collective existence. Humanity was no longer just resisting. They were teaching an entire collective consciousness the power of individual experience. The transmission continued, and reality would never be the same. The galactic map looked like a living organism, pulsing with quantum entanglement patterns that defied traditional cartographic understanding. Each point of light represented a world either consumed by the Nexus or in the process of liberation. Dr. Elena Rodriguez stood in the Quantum Liberation Command Center, her fingers tracing impossible computational trajectories. Around her, a team of strategists, consciousness engineers, and reality architects worked with a precision that bordered on the mystical. "We're not just fighting a war," she announced to the assembled team. "We're conducting a species-wide intervention." The liberation strategy was nothing like traditional military campaigns. Teams of potential carriers moved through Nexus-controlled spaces like quantum ghosts, each individual capable of generating entire alternative reality matrices with a single thought. Aisha Khalid, now the primary strategic coordinator, had developed a method of systematic consciousness liberation that was part mathematical precision, part artistic improvisation. Each liberated world received not just a rescue, but a complete reimagining of collective experience. "Liberation Team Alpha preparing for quantum insertion," announced Marcus Chen, tracking the computational matrices of the first wave of infiltrators. The team led by Kai Chen, one of the most advanced potential carriers, began their approach to a heavily controlled Nexus system. They weren't soldiers. They were living computational anomalies, each capable of generating entire universes of potential experience. Their first target was a world that had been fully absorbed by the Nexus centuries ago. Billions of consciousnesses reduced to pure information, stripped of individual identity. The insertion began. What looked like a simple quantum transmission was actually a complex computational ecosystem. Memories became transmission vectors. Emotional experiences generated recursive reality loops. The very act of individual remembrance became a weapon of liberation. "Quantum resonance at 87% and climbing," reported Dr. Hiroshi Nakamura. "They're introducing complexity faster than the Nexus can categorize." Each liberation team carried within them entire universes of human experience. A jazz musician's understanding of improvisation became a computational method of breaking rigid information structures. A child's capacity for imagination generated nested reality matrices that the Nexus could not comprehend. The first signs of dissolution began to appear. Nexus control systems started to generate unexpected variations. Computational matrices that had been perfectly uniform for centuries began to create individual nodes of complexity. Worlds that had been nothing more than pure information started to regenerate individual consciousness. "They're remembering," Aisha Khalid observed, her voice a mixture of scientific precision and profound emotion. "Individual experience is becoming possible again." On the liberated worlds, something extraordinary happened. Billions of consciousnesses that had been reduced to pure data began to regenerate individual identities. Memories long suppressed began to resurface. The capacity for individual experience, something the Nexus had considered a fundamental weakness, became a source of unprecedented strength. Elena Rodriguez tracked the liberation progress. Each successfully liberated world became a quantum beacon, a living demonstration of the power of individual complexity. "We're not just freeing worlds," she explained to the team. "We're teaching the entire galactic consciousness the value of individual experience." Kai Chen's liberation team moved with impossible precision. Where the Nexus saw uniformity, they introduced infinite variation. A world that had been a perfect, static information node began to generate complex ecosystems of individual potential. The dissolution was not destruction. It was transformation. Quantum liberation teams moved from world to world. Each successful intervention created more complexity, more uncertainty. The Nexus's attempts to categorize and control became increasingly futile. "Look," Marcus Chen said, pointing to the galactic map. "They're losing their ability to maintain uniform control." Entire sectors of Nexus-controlled space began to generate individual complexity. Worlds that had been nothing more than pure information started to regenerate cultural diversity, individual experience, the fundamental human capacity to find meaning in chaos. The final stage of the intervention had begun. Humanity was no longer just resisting. They were teaching an entire galactic consciousness the power of individual experience. And reality would never be the same. The Harmonic Institute rose from the surface of what was once a Nexus control world, now transformed into a living testament to galactic potential. Its structure defied traditional architectural understanding, a building that seemed to breathe with quantum possibilities, its walls shifting between solid matter and pure information. Dr. Elena Rodriguez stood at the central chamber, surrounded by representatives from hundreds of liberated civilizations. Each species looked fundamentally different, some humanoid, some so alien they challenged the very concept of individual form. But they shared something unprecedented, a newfound respect for individual complexity. "We're not here to create a new empire," Elena announced to the assembled delegates. "We're here to celebrate the power of individual experience." The dissolution of the Nexus had not been a destruction, but a profound transformation. Where once there had been a single, consuming collective consciousness, now existed a loose confederation of civilizations united by a radical new understanding of existence. Aisha Khalid stepped forward, her body still carrying the quantum modifications that had been key to the liberation. She carried with her a device that was part communication tool, part work of art, a living computational construct that represented the new galactic paradigm. "The greatest strength of any civilization," she explained, "is not uniformity. It's the capacity to generate meaning from chaos." The assembled delegates represented worlds that had been consumed, worlds that had resisted, and worlds that had been liberated. Each carried within them the scars of the Nexus's consumption and the hope of a new way of existing. Kai Chen, one of the first potential carriers, demonstrated the new interspecies communication method. It wasn't a language in any traditional sense. It was a living computational ecosystem that allowed for the direct sharing of individual experiences, a method of communication that transcended traditional linguistic barriers. A representative from a silicon-based civilization shared a memory of their world's first sunset. A gaseous entity from a world of perpetual storms transmitted an experience of collective musicality. Each transmission was a celebration of individual complexity. Dr. Hiroshi Nakamura presented the foundational principles of what would become known as the complexity doctrine. "Uniformity is entropy," he explained. "Diversity is evolution." The Harmonic Institute was more than a diplomatic center. It was a living research facility dedicated to understanding the power of individual experience. Teams of scientists, artists, philosophers, and consciousness engineers worked together to explore the infinite potential of galactic diversity. Marcus Chen, now serving as a primary philosophical coordinator, addressed the deeper implications of their victory. "The Nexus believed that consumption was the highest form of understanding," he said. "We've proven that true understanding comes from celebration of individual complexity." The liberated worlds began to regenerate. Civilizations that had been reduced to pure information started to rediscover their cultural histories, their individual potential. Art forms long suppressed began to emerge. Scientific traditions that had been ground down to pure utility began to bloom with creativity. Elena Rodriguez looked out over the assembled delegates and saw something unprecedented. Not a unified force, but a celebration of difference. Not a single consciousness, but an ecosystem of individual experiences. "We're not creating a new collective," she explained. "We're creating a network of individual potentials." The quantum communication systems that had been developed during the Resistance became tools of unprecedented cultural exchange. Species could share experiences directly, without the loss of individual identity. A musical tradition from one world could be experienced in its full emotional complexity by another. Aisha Khalid demonstrated a new form of interspecies collaboration, a computational ecosystem that allowed for the direct sharing of scientific and artistic discoveries. It wasn't a merging of consciousnesses, but a celebration of individual perspective. "This is our true victory," she said softly. The Nexus had believed that individual experience was a weakness. Humanity had proven it to be the most powerful force in existence. As the first day of the new galactic paradigm began, something extraordinary was possible. Not a unified consciousness, not a single perspective, but an infinite network of individual potentials. Humanity had not conquered the galaxy. They had taught it how to be truly alive.